Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a fantastic day. My name is Kmart, and I want to talk about some basketball. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about free agency and a couple of the names. A couple of the names that are still available at this point. Free agency has kind of, for the most part, come and gone. Right, all the heavy hitters have been sort of picked up. There's not too much drama left in terms of off-season moves. We've really sort of gotten into the situation now where we're waiting on some of those big trades to play out, right? To see what happens with guys like James Harden, Damian Lillard, maybe even the Pascal Siakam situation that I talked about earlier this week. So those are kind of the big moves remaining, though those sort of marquee trades. But in terms of free agency, there are still a couple of guys available. They've been the same guys who have been sort of at the top of still available lists for a couple of weeks now, just because they haven't really been picked up yet. So, you're probably going to be familiar with some of the names here. So, we'll try and go through it relatively quickly and not belabor the point, because like I said, these are the same guys who have been available for a little while here. So, we'll throw up some numbers and we'll talk about maybe why they deserve to be picked up and maybe part of the reason why they haven't been picked up yet. But we will start the list with probably the most obvious choice, that is Christian Wood. Most recently played for the Dallas Mavericks, and obviously it does not have a team just yet. So, throwing up the stats for him from last season: 16.6 points per game, 7.3 rebounds, 1.8 assists, 1.1 blocks in there as well, shooting 51.5% from the field, 37.6% from three. So, if you just were to look at those numbers, it doesn't really make sense that he's not on a team right now, to be perfectly honest. Those are pretty impressive numbers. Um, 16.6 points isn't going to sort of blow anybody out of the water, but that's relatively consistent scoring. You're picking up solid rebounds. He plays okay defense, maybe a little bit inconsistent, but his shooting from the field is pretty impressive, right? Over 50% overall, 37.6 from beyond the arc. That's a pretty solid clip for anyone, let alone someone like Christian Wood, who's in that sort of small forward, more power forward range. He's got that kind of stretch forward touch to him. But in this previous season, his profile did kind of drop off a little bit, right? He started off the season strong. Um, I think he missed a relatively short stretch of time with an injury and then ended up sort of getting relegated to a bench role for most of the season. So that took some eyes away from him. And then, of course, he's playing a more bench oriented role the second half of the season when the media attention was all over sort of the Luka and Kyrie Irving duo. And obviously, that was followed immediately by them kind of shutting down for the final couple of games there to try and keep their draft pick. So none of that was super conducive to Wood getting a whole lot of attention. But it still doesn't really make sense that he's not signed, right? Um, yeah, like I said, his defense is a little inconsistent. He sometimes has a reputation for being a sort of block shot hunter instead of playing his guy more often than not. But the energy is there. The scoring is solid. Those rebounding numbers, 7.3 per game, are pretty damn good. And the fact is, you would think you could get Christian Wood for relatively cheap here. He made $14.3 million last season. And at this point, this late in free agency, it seems unlikely that Christian Wood or his people are going to sort of get greedy here. I really don't think they're going to want to hold out for north of $20 million, right? So a team could pick him up, get either a decent starter or a really strong bench guy if they want to keep him in that role that Dallas sort of pushed him into for, I don't know, somewhere in the 16 to 18 million dollar a year range. Maybe you do have to bump it up to 20 million if you are a team that did not have a fantastic record last year, just to really entice him. But I don't think you go much higher than that. And Christian Wood's stats, both for last season and across his time with both Dallas and Houston before that, are relatively consistent. So we shall see. There's always been rumors about this team or that. I think the Lakers have been tied to Christian Wood a couple of times, and the interest levels flip flop basically every other day for some of these teams. But somebody's got to be looking at Christian Wood. In a similar fashion, moving on to player number 2 on the list here, PJ Washington. Most recently played for the Charlotte Hornets and may actually end up playing for them again here. We'll get to that in a second. We'll talk about his numbers first. From the previous season, 15.7 points, 4.9 rebounds, 2.4 assists, 1.1 blocks, 44.4% from the field, 34.8% from 3. So, kind of like Christian Wood here, a guy who has been able to take that step out, play that sort of floor spacing, three-point shooting role. Obviously, not a sharpshooter, just shy of 35% is good, but not great. But it's pretty solid. PJ Washington's still a very young guy coming off of basically his rookie scale contract here. Now, his rebounding numbers could be slightly higher, 4.9 per game. You would like if maybe he could bump that up a little bit as he goes here, but he's made up for that with good energy, pretty good passing for a big man as well, and that sort of outside touch, as we said, just shy of 35%. So he's not a sniper, but he is more reliable than most in his position. The part that's complicated for PJ Washington here is that he's a restricted free agent. Charlotte did give him a qualifying offer. So if any team were to go out and look for PJ Washington and try to give him an offer themselves, the Hornets could simply match that offer and keep him automatically. So basically, Charlotte's waiting until the last possible minute here to keep Washington for as little as possible. They're not going to give him anything other than that qualifying offer because, I mean, you would like to keep him for as little money as possible. And if no other team's going to make an offer, then PJ Washington has to basically accept that qualifying offer and play for relatively cheap, or get nothing and basically not play at all. So if you're the Hornets, you like this situation. You want PJ Washington to stay on this list for as long as possible, because then you get to keep him for very little money. So it's fantastic from their perspective. But for other teams looking at PJ Washington and how much they might have to pay, it's a little bit strange, because if you're just looking at it from the value of the player, Washington made between $4 and $6 million per year on his rookie scale contract, which was the first 4 seasons of his career. That is kind of a regulated scale. He couldn't really go much higher than that. So you would think, okay, well, PJ Washington, you could probably give him an offer. Well, not for $4 or $6 million. I think he's worth more than that, but definitely something that wouldn't break the bank. The problem is that kind of works against a team trying to go for him, because if the idea is that Washington could be picked up for cheap, that means that the Hornets probably would not be overly concerned with just matching that offer, right? So that's the danger. If you're a non-Charlotte team looking for PJ Washington, it's not that you need to think about how much his value has increased by. You need to increase your offer by a little bit more, because you're trying to disincentivize Charlotte from matching that contract offer. And I think the uncertainty of that, of how much more that might tack on to the price for PJ Washington, is part of the reason why some teams have not really made any offers to him as of yet. Or at least none that we know of, right? Could be stuff going on behind the scenes that simply hasn't been announced. But that's the deal for Washington. Teams are trying to sort of wait, maybe kick the tires, feel things out, and see what the actual market for him ends up looking like. But for now, we don't really have a whole lot. But that moves us on to the third player on the list. It's another guy from the Hornets, Kelly Oubre Jr. A bit of an interesting situation, right? For basically the opposite reason of PJ Washington, as we take a look at Oubre Jr.'s stats. 20.3 points, 5.2 rebounds, 1.1 assists, 1.4 steals, 43.1% from the field, 31.9% from 3. So, the scoring is pretty impressive there, right? Of course, Oubre Jr. putting up 20 plus points per game on a relatively bad Hornets squad is not going to get a crazy amount of attention. There's also the fact that Oubre Jr. played basically half a season. He only played about 48 games. So I think that's part of the reason why there hasn't been a massive rush of people trying to sign him, is that people aren't sure if those numbers are going to be consistent across a whole season, and they're not sure if it's going to be consistent if you're playing for a team that's trying to compete for something versus the Hornets, who are just kind of running out there and showcasing talent. But honestly, I think it's still pretty impressive, right? The scoring ability was there. 5.2 rebounds from a wing player always sort of adds strong value to your resume, right? But the knock on Oubre Jr. here is that his efficiency was pretty bad. He shot just over 43% from the field, as we mentioned, which is not ideal, especially when you consider in that previous season, over those 48 games, he was averaging about 17 shots per game. So 20 points is good, but on 17 shots is maybe not quite the efficiency you want, especially if you're a non-Charlotte team and you're looking to pick up Oubre Jr. to maybe add him to a more competitive roster. The scoring ability then sort of gets very much downgraded, because if you add Oubre Jr. to a more competitive team, he is not going to get, or is extremely unlikely to get, 17 shots per game as the third or fourth option, or a guy off the bench, right? So, yeah, his field goal percentage is not great. That 3-point percentage at just under 32% is not great either, especially since we mentioned the 17 shots per game. He was taking 7 threes per game for Charlotte last season, and hitting 32% of that is, again, it's not terrible, but it's not ideal. He's also not exactly a surefire free throw shooter at 76% last season, so yeah, he needs a lot of shots to score his points. He's not the most efficient from the line, although 76% is not terrible again. But that's the whole point. Everything about Oubre Jr., you look at the stats and you say that's relatively impressive, but the efficiency is concerning. But even so, the potential is there, the ability is there, efficiency and shot selection is definitely something I think that might be easier for a player like Oubre to focus in on, compared to just lacking the ability to score in general. And he's probably not going to break the bank here either, right? The highest salary that he's had in his career was $15.6 million. He was paid $12.6 million last season, so you could sign him to a short-term deal, 2-3 years. Don't think he would exceed the 20 million mark, so definitely an option for a lot of teams there, but he does come with some concerns in terms of that efficiency. But that moves us along to the final sort of main name on the list here. That is Hamidou Diallo. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but whatever. In terms of his stats, it's maybe not quite as impressive just from a statistical standpoint as some of the previous guys. 9.3 points, 3.5 rebounds, 1 assist, 57.3% from the field. So if you were just looking at the numbers, Diallo's really not that impressive. But he kind of makes this list due to a mix of two things: his defense and his efficiency, right? Diallo is young, he's athletic, he's got reach. I think it's like a 7-foot wingspan in total for him or something like that. Plays with energy and plays solid defense, even if he isn't necessarily racking up steals and blocks. He's not necessarily the guy who actually gets the credit for those plays, but he plays some pretty impressive defense. If you're looking into things like steal and block rates, defensive win shares, defensive plus minus, things like that, Diallo is normally pretty high up on that list for these first couple of years. And then efficiency-wise, he's gotten significantly better compared to the previous season as well. 2 seasons ago, he shot 49.6% from the field, which is already pretty solid. Last season, he bumped that up to that aforementioned 57.3%, and he actually took about 2 fewer shots per game, which that normally is a good way to sort of get your efficiency up, is if you take fewer shots, but it's the idea that Diallo was more judicious, right? Taking smarter shots and improving his efficiency that way. He took better shots, he stayed in his role, he played good defense, he's not going to be an offensive powerhouse. His three-point shooting and his free throw shooting are kind of terrible. Part of the reason why I didn't include it in his stats here. But he knows his role, right? He can go out, he can get you some points, he takes shots when he's open, he doesn't try to force it, and he plays solid defense. And that's the kind of guy that a lot of teams really do need if they're going to try and make any sort of noise in the postseason. So, sure, the lack of sort of outside touch and free throw shooting does hurt his value, but not by much. And honestly, he's on a pretty cheap contract in the first place. Last season, he made $5.2 million, and if the Pistons don't feel inclined to keep him, which kind of seems like they don't, that, like I said, teams could absolutely use an athletic, efficient, defensive-minded young player who is probably going to cost you less than $10 million per year. So, kind of surprised that Diallo hasn't been picked up by somebody. But those are the main sort of names on the list here in terms of honorable mentions, I guess we'll say. Also got guys in there like Willie Hernan-Gomez, most recently at the Pelicans, Wenyen Gabriel, who played for the Lakers, Justice Winslow, who I believe last played for the Trailblazers. I'm going to have to double check that in editing. But he's on that list. Even guys like Bismack Biyombo is in there as well. These are all guys who are potentially still useful, right? They're not going to stuff the stat sheet, but they can go out and play 15 to 20 minutes for you every night in a bench role pretty damn easily and still sort of make contributions. But all of those guys I mentioned, those four in the honorable mentions, they've got kind of maybe less defined roles, or they're less reliable in terms of both their level of play and, for some of these guys, their actual health as well. But those are a couple of names that I didn't really want to go into depth into. But those are the big four, the main guys for me. Christian Wood, Kelly Oubre Jr., PJ Washington, and Hamidou Diallo are still available. So, obviously, we still got a long way to go before the season starts. I do not believe any of those four guys that I mentioned actually start the season without a team. In fact, I don't even think any of the guys in the honorable mentions section don't find their way to a team eventually, just because teams are going to fill out those final couple of roster spots that they might be holding on to before we actually tip off. So all these guys should find spots. It's just a question of where they go and how much they end up getting paid, because their value basically was guaranteed to take a hit if they're still available at this stage. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Obviously, maybe some of these names are a little bit obvious. Maybe you've got some other names for the honorable mentions section, but if you think that there's someone out there with high value who's still available, let me know, and we shall see, what names sort of pop up the most. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you later.